What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another thread video for you guys here today. Now, it seems like everybody really has been enjoying my recent thread videos, like the two-part series of the 20 badass metal album covers video that happened a couple of weeks ago. 100 plus views on each of them. Thank you guys who saw those videos and dropped some responses. But now I'm back for a new thread. Now this one's a bit unique because typically whenever us metal YouTube channels are doing thread videos, it's mostly about the music or about musicians, albums, what have you, bands. But I figured, how about I talk about something from behind the curtain, if you will. And that is the record labels, which is why this thread is titled 10 Great Metal Record Labels Past and Present. Now, of course, there's going to be a couple of controversial ones for differing reasons, and I'll talk about them when we get to those labels. But really, ever since the 80s, like with the advent of independent record labels coming up in the 80s, and then more come up over the years, and hell, even today, there are more independent record labels out there than ever now, with labels like Redefining Darkness, Hell's Headbangers, there was Dying Victims Productions. There's a lot of great labels out there, and of course, some bands like to go independent and do their own thing through Patreon or Bandcamp, what have you, or DistroKid, as 66 Samus would use. But there are still great record labels out there for metal that still fully support the bands. Of course, there are a couple of labels that have had lost reputations, but you can't ignore their past. So why don't we get started on this list, and we kick things off with Century Media Records. Now keep in mind, this is not a top 10 list. I'm just showcasing 10 great labels for differing reasons. But with Century Media Records, was created back in 1988, so it was a late 80s label. And kind of similar to a couple of other labels I'm going to talk about a little bit later, where they kind of started off more in the hardcore realm, that eventually became a metal label by signing metal bands. And with Century Media, yeah, it was basically they started out more of a hardcore label. Then over the next few years, you would see more and more metal bands pop up on Century Media Records. And held to this day, you got a strong lineup of bands that vary from death metal to hard rock to black metal even. You got so many. You got like Napalm Death, Arch Enemy, Fozzy, Swallow the Sun, among so many other bands. Now, if I had to choose my favorite album from Century Media Records, for me personally, it's Asphyx, Last One on Earth. And, of course, this band has been the longest tenured band on Century Media. I believe they signed to that label in like late 1990, early 1991. Every studio album they've put out since has been on Century Media, but out of all of the Century Media albums, this is my go-to just because, I've said it before, I'll say it again, the greatest Death Doom album of all time. And even Century Media in recent years have kind of dipped their... they've always kind of been kind of like a good toe, like a big... what's the word I'm looking for? Like they have a big toe in the Death Doom scene because of Asphyx, and then over the years, like I said, Swallow the Sun is on Century Media, among a few others. But yeah, my go-to album for Century Media Records is Last One on Earth by Asphyx. So now, on to one of the two controversial labels on this list, and that is, of course, Earache Records. Earache Records, formed back in 1985 by Digby Pearson over in England. And again, kind of like Century Media, started off more in the punk, hardcore realm. Then eventually, over time, metal bands would latch on to Earache Records. And of course, being the first album released on that label being Napalm Death Scum in 1987. And so many killer bands over the course of the last almost 40 years of the label's existence have popped in and out of Earache, like I said, Napalm Death, Morbid Angel, Entombed, Carcass, Terrorizer, Decapitated, Vader, Akercocke, I could go, Nocturnus, I can go on and on. Of course, where the controversy lies is the fact that Digby did not pay a lot of the bands a whole lot of money and may have lied about record sales. I mean, you could do your own research about like why Earache has an iffy reputation, and really when you look at Earache now, really the only standout bands on that label are Blackberry Smoke and Terrorizer. Apart from that, Earache is a shell of what they used to be. But you can't ignore their past with amazing albums. Yeah, the business practices may be a little iffy, or really iffy, depending on how you want to look at it. But in terms of the widespread of getting people into the more extreme side, you can't ignore Earache Records' legacy in that sense. And for my favorite album from Earache Records, for me, would be Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness. I mean, my number 2 first wave death metal album behind Death Leprosy. But yeah, Altars of Madness, it's a classic for a reason, and of course, Earache was the label that put them on the map. And also, interestingly enough, Morbid Angel being the first American band that Earache signed, and the first band in death metal that they signed too. So, very important album here on all fronts. But yeah, iffy reputation, but can't ignore their past. Now on to the third label on this list, and that is an important one, especially in the development of thrash, Megaforce Records. Megaforce Records, founded in 1982 by Johnny and Marcia Zazula, who are very important people to metal as a whole, because pretty much they decided to make their own label because, well, Metallica was booming in the underground, but no label wanted them. Like, nobody wanted Metallica, so Johnny and Marcia decided, you know what, this band needs some press out there, they need music sent out to the world, why don't we make our own label, we'll sign them, and get their music out there. And thank God for that. And then even over the years, you know, Anthrax would eventually, not too long after, be on Megaforce. You would have Overkill on Megaforce, Testament on Megaforce, and even still bands to this day, like Megaforce, I don't know if they're still around in its purest form right now, especially after Johnny passed away a year or two ago, but their impact on the thrash scene, especially the East Coast scene, was definitely important. And this was an easy choice for my favorite Megaforce album, and that is Metallica Ride the Lightning. I mean, what more can be said about this album that hasn't been said already? It's a classic for a reason, and it was Metallica's final album on Megaforce before they would go to the majors of Elektra. But yeah, classic album, and Megaforce, thank God for Johnny and Marcia, otherwise, who the fuck knows what would have happened to thrash. So yeah, Ride the Lightning, Metallica for my pick for the best, or at the very least my favorite, Megaforce record album. Now we get to, from one side of being important in terms of American extreme music, to the West Coast, and that is Metal Blade Records. Metal Blade Records, founded in 1981 by, of course, the legend himself, Brian Slagel. And Metal Blade, again, kind of similar to Megaforce, was very important in terms of like that early thrash scene, because you had the Metal Massacre compilation where Metallica had Hit the Lights, their first version of that song on Metal Massacre. And then over the next few years, you know, you would see bands like Celtic Frost get like an American deal with Metal Blade, same with Sodom, Slayer, and then really since the late 80s, Brian and even Mike Faley, who's I forget, like the president, I can't remember, but he is in charge of the East Coast operations of Metal Blade. And over the years, you know, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Amon Amarth, Cattle Decapitation, even Killswitch Engage is on Metal Blade now. Over the years, in like Bulk Thrower, Immolation, among so many bands, I could go on and on with that. And Metal Blade's reputation is one of the best reputations for a label out there, because Brian said himself, he wants to give bands a chance to have a career. And Look at, like I said, all the bands, and like Cannibal Corpse have been on that label since the very beginning of their career, and it's incredible that they can still stay on a label for now, what is it, 33 years that they've been on Metal Blade, which is incredible. And even Fate's Warning, despite a couple of albums being away from Metal Blade, they're back on Metal Blade, and they were a long-standing band and one of the big ones from back in the day. And now, as far as a favorite album for me from Metal Blade Records, Slayer Hell Awaits, one of my favorite thrash albums, and the last Slayer album on Metal Blade. Like, their first two and their EP, both on, all three on Metal Blade, and they were important albums to that genre, or not to that genre, but to the label. But yeah, Hell Awaits, my favorite Slayer album personally, not the best, but my personal favorite, and my favorite album on Metal Blade Records. So yeah, can't go wrong with some Slayer Hell Awaits in that discussion. But now on to, perhaps, even though this is not a top 10 list, I will go on record and say that this is probably my favorite record label in metal history, Nuclear Blast Records. Nuclear Blast, founded in 1987 in Germany, and again, kind of like Century Media and Earache, started off more of a hardcore label that eventually became a metal label just a couple years later when the guys in charge were signing metal bands, most particularly death metal early on, like Monstrosity, Sinister, and a few others. But then really, kind of ever since, I'm going to say, like the early to mid 2000s, Nuclear Blast just exploded into perhaps the biggest metal label going today, because look at the roster of bands that they have now, like Testament, Accept, Blood Red Throne, Machine Head, Enslaved, Immolation. There's just a ton. Slayer was on Nuclear Blast for their final run, and there's just so many killer bands and great albums that have come out of Nuclear Blast Records. Hell, if I were to guess, back there with the collection, at least I'm going to say like a sixth of my collection is probably albums from Nuclear Blast Records, because Nuclear Blast just know how to get some great bands, and those bands, for the most part, make great fucking music. And nothing more, nothing less can be said about that. As far as my personal favorite album from Nuclear Blast Records, this one was difficult because there are a lot of great ones, but for me, Testament, The Formation of Damnation. Yeah, this was their first one on Nuclear Blast after 9 years of dormancy due to cancer and other issues, but Nuclear Blast picked Testament up, and they come back with this monster of an album, and Testament have been on a roll pretty much ever since this album came out. So, thank you, Nuclear Blast, for picking up these guys and giving them something to believe in again, and so many other great bands, like I said, and albums that I could have mentioned. But for me, I'm going with Formation of Damnation for the fact that Nuclear Blast picked up on Testament and gave them a second wind, essentially. So now we're halfway through the list, and now moving on to another obscure one, at least at first, and now it become something pretty cool. Peaceville Records. Peaceville Records, which is a UK label founded in 1987, and kind of similar to Century Media in terms of having like a toe in Death Doom, because Peaceville, like early on, they were having like Death Doom albums, like early Autopsy and early Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, early Anathema, among so many other Death Doom bands. So they definitely have like a toe in that fusion genre, but of course have had toes in other places like black metal and death metal. I mean, and again, great bands have come and gone through that label. Opeth, Bloodbath, Catatonia, Autopsy, Paradise Lost, amongst many others. But if I had to pick my personal favorite album from Peaceville Records, and I was torn between two albums. I was torn between the one that I ended up choosing and another one. And I'll just say the other one was Autopsy Mental Funeral, but for me, my favorite Peaceville Records release Dark Throne, A Blaze in the Northern Sky. Also, my personal favorite black metal album of all time. Or at least up there. No, it would be number 2 for me behind Bathory Under the Sign of the Black Mark. But A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Peaceville Records, and it's crazy to think the story behind how this album got released, because this was shortly after Dark Throne changed from being death metal to black metal, because they didn't want to play death metal anymore. And they send the final masters to Peaceville, and Peaceville calls back, like, what the hell is this? And Fenris is like, this is black metal. And they're like, well, we signed you as a death metal band. What are you doing? And Fenris is like, no, we don't want to play death metal anymore. We want to play what we feel. And they were like, well, we want to at least remix this because it sounds weak. But Fenris said, no, if you don't like it, we'll take it over to Euronymous' label. And Peaceville caved in. And their initial thought was, oh, maybe it'll do bad and they'll go back to playing death metal. But no, this album was very well received. It's a classic to this day. And after the guys in charge of Peaceville got into it after a while, they were like, okay, we understand what they were talking about. And you know what? Let's see if they can keep building on that and keep making black metal. And despite a long gap where they weren't on Peaceville anymore, they eventually went back to Peaceville and have been on a roll for the most part ever since they went back to Peaceville in like the mid to late 2000s. But yeah, Dark Throne, A Blaze in the Northern Sky, my personal favorite Peaceville Records release. Now we get into kind of another one with a great reputation similar to Metal Blade, and that is Relapse Records. And Relapse is the newest label in terms of the year it was founded that's on my list, as this label was founded in 1990, so this is the baby of the family of this list. But Relapse, again, wanting to push the more extreme side, so Relapse early on was all about signing death metal and grindcore bands, or just stuff that just makes you feel uncomfortable. And kind of were in direct competition, especially in the mid to late 90s, with Earache Records, as like Brutal Truth left Earache to go to Relapse. And then over the years, just more great bands have come through Relapse, like Incantation, who started there and are currently there now, Dying Fetus, Nile, and even some metal giants of today, including, which is my favorite release from Relapse Records, and that's Mastodon, Leviathan. Who would have thought one of the biggest metal bands going in the world today came from such a raw, nasty label in Relapse? And this was a Relapse release 2004, and I want to say this was their last album on Relapse, though I think they were still having versions of Blood Mountain on Relapse, even though they eventually went to Reprise Records. But this album is a modern metal gem. I mean, the concept album on Moby Dick. And I'm going to be talking more about this whenever we get to the Mastodon album ranking video later this week. So, yeah, Mastodon, Leviathan, my favorite album on Relapse Records. And now we get to the second controversial label on the list, and that is, and also the oldest label on this list, Roadrunner Records. Roadrunner formed and founded back in 1980, so by 1 year over Metal Blade that they've been around as a long-standing label. Now they're a major label now, which is cool, but at the same token, it's like, I'll talk more about it here in just a moment, but like, back in Roadrunner's heyday, from the 80s through to about the mid to late 90s, holy shit, they could do no wrong. Monty Connor, who became the A&R guy at Roadrunner, now currently, I believe he's an A&R guy for Nuclear Blast, and good on him, because Monty Connor's an important figure. And, like, their early run with bands like Merciful Fate and Carnivore and Annihilator, King Diamond, great stuff. And then they became the death metal label for a long time, because look at the death metal bands that came on to Roadrunner during the late 80s through to the mid 90s, like Obituary, Suffocation, Malevolent Creation, Early Immolation, Death, even eventually, Deicide, so many great bands. Now, of course, the controversy lies that once nu metal started to hit big, they cashed in on that and got like Slipknot, which, no disrespect to Slipknot. And then eventually the metalcore thing came up, and then they had like Kill Switch, which was cool. But even during that time of having nu metal and metalcore, they still had some great bands coming through, like Trivium, who are still there to this day. Opeth had some great music on Roadrunner for a while. Ghost Reveries being my second favorite Opeth album. And Gojira, who are there currently. However, despite their success, now they're a shell of what they used to be, because the only notable bands that are on Roadrunner right now are Code Orange, Coheed and Cambria, Gojira, Stone Sour, Trivium, and that's all. Like, they don't have very many big bands on Roadrunner anymore. So it's like, Roadrunner, you need to get your shit together. But if I had to choose my personal favorite Roadrunner album, it's Death Symbolic. What more can I say about this album that hasn't been said already? And this was their only album on Roadrunner, and it's a classic. That's all I'm going to say. Now for the penultimate one on the list. And actually, no, this is the newest label on the list. I accidentally typed the wrong number. But no, Relapse isn't the baby. This label I'm going to talk about is the baby of the list, as this label was founded in 1996, and that's Season of Mist Records. And Season of Mist has become a pretty solid label in the underground, like pretty much mostly getting like black metal and death metal on their label. Like currently you have, I believe Mayhem is on the label right now, or at least they were. Hate Eternal. Ooh, burps. Among so many others. So yeah, definitely not as big of a catalog as the other labels on this list, but they are important in terms of the extreme side. Black metal, death metal, doom, even some thrash pops in here and there on Season of Mist. Yeah, infamously put out Morbid Angel's Aluminum Anus, but hey, that's just one bad album out of a bunch of great ones. Now, if I had to choose my favorite album from Season of Mist, it's the latest one on this whole thing, Hooded Menace to Tridentous Bell. I mean, Hooded Menace now and I also forgot they were on Relapse for a little while too, but now they're on Season of Mist, and this was probably their best work on Season of Mist in my opinion, and it's their last one it's almost a year old. So yeah, Hooded Menace, Tridentous Bell, my favorite on Season of Mist. And now for the final label, and this is kind of a splinter label, and that's SPV/Steamhammer Records, which is a German label founded in early 1984, and they were I almost kind of view SPV Steamhammer as like the German version of Metal Blade, because they were very important in the early development of thrash. You know, you had Destruction, Sodom, amongst so many others, and I believe, Tankard I think was on Noise Records. I could be wrong, though. But even over the years, they've had big bands come and go through SPV. Judas Priest, Typo Negative, and Sepultura. And this label's still active to this day, with Sodom being the big toe in that label. And should be to no shock that my favorite album from SPV Steamhammer is Sodom Persecution Mania. I've talked about this album to death in the Sodom album ranking, and it came out on SPV. So SPV know how to get good bands and help them out so much, and Sodom is the king of that label. I think there's no dispute. If you say there's a better band on that label, I'm sorry. But yeah, Sodom Persecution Mania, my favorite album on SPV Steamhammer. And that does it for this video, and this was challenging because, yeah, there are so many great ones that I didn't even put on the list. Like I said, I could have put Redefining Darkness, Hell's Headbangers, Napalm Records. I thought I had it on the list at one point, but I took it out in favor of something else. But there are great metal labels out there that give bands careers, money, and they can go on to those labels forever, it seems, as Cannibal Corpse, who have been on Metal Blade since their start, Asphyx on Century Media since their start. The list goes on and on. But yeah, for those of you who make videos, make a response to this. What are your favorite metal record labels and favorite album of each of those labels? Or if you don't have a channel, make a comment down below letting me know your favorite record label in metal history and favorite album from that label. But until next time, horns high. See you guys later.
At the ballpark, someone's gonna put lasagna.
I took a tomato.
Okay, yeah, it's Levi. It's Levi.
Damn it.
I'm done. Could I?
I want to know what he got for this one.
All right, Seth, let's go to Tomato Town.
Seth is dying.
I would like a single slice of your greatest tomatoes
I
in
would
the
like
park.
to find this tomato, please.
Calm down, Seth. Calm down, Seth. Calm down.
Somebody vote.
No, it's
Levi.
five is the
Levi's
max.
the one that has some
Levi is
votes.
the majority.
Yeah.
Oh
my
my
lord. Seth, breathe.
Oh.
Tomato. I'm gonna be really interested to see these prompts.
Yeah, like
Officer,
literally.
please escort me out of the ballpark. I just wanted to eat my tomato.